All right, well, we're going to get started. And so welcome
Yep.
everyone to our South Salem episode number 2. And from around Oregon and welcome. Of course, I first Sam Bray, if you don't know him. But we're glad that you could join us. And today's about spirituality in our kids' home, and especially in a place where we're all kind of resigned to. It's very important. We take advantage of this opportunity and to teach our kids and to model for them Christianity. So the theme would be, and if we could stop sharing the slide, it stay home, ways in which we can nurture, and just going to introduce the thing, do that, and then we'll introduce special guest Brent Hunter, all the way from practical things and how you can take action, or you can message, or you can YouTube, you can post, ask your questions or your suggestions. And so let's this theme because it's interesting, or a gift from God, and whose quiver's full. That's a different attitude today. You think your children are blessed, but there are unique challenges for kids. And so, Sam, what can you tell us about some of those challenges children and families and parents face with raising their kids at home?
Yeah. So Jack said the theme is stay home, stay small. But one of the plus sides is that we're at home with our youth. And really, it's a great time almost to hit like a reset button because the youth and teenagers, and I know myself, I'm 26, so it wasn't that long ago that I was a teenager. The youth are facing, a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers. And so just some statistics for you guys.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hold on a second. Just some statistics for you guys. Young Christians today, 70 to 75% of teens who attended church regularly in high school stopped by age 23. Those are staggering numbers. And so we're rapidly losing youth in the church. And, it's one thing to kind of look at those numbers, but you got to ask the reason, why is that? And I know sometimes the response is, well, it's just kids these days, right? But the fact is kids are facing a lot of challenges. And so one of those examples that we're looking at here, and just for some statistics sake, one of the challenges is media, isn't it? I mean, it seems like entertainment is such a big central part of everybody's life. And it's interesting that teens, they really gravitate towards anything that's put in the media, whether it's YouTube, TikTok. They have all these different people that they're looking to that influence them through media. And so I found this interesting. It says 76% of teens said that one reason young people have sex is because TV shows and movies make it seem normal. That's really interesting. That is true. If you think about it, how many sitcoms, how many TV shows do you watch where that kind of behavior outside of marriage is just kind of casual?
So the voice of media is louder than the voice of parents, or the church
Yeah,
as well, right?
and the question is, they're getting all this information. Are we providing verses and Bible teaching to combat what they're getting really on a constant basis almost? If it's not media, then it's the other place where they're spending 6 hours of every day, education. 25% of college professors claim to be atheist or agnostic. And you say, well, 25%, that's not very many. But that's a quarter. That's a quarter of all teachers. And it's not like the rest of them are Christian. Maybe they have some sort of other religious affiliation, something like that. But 25% of college professors claim to be atheists or agnostic, and only 6% consider the Bible to be the word of God. So when you talk about raising our kids, we really have to make sure, and of course I don't have kids, but we have to make sure that we're preparing them, and that as young people, we're prepared to handle the conflict that we're going to be encountering once we get to higher education, because this is just the reality. I found this really interesting. There are some statistics here, just as far as what, quote, youth ministers, the challenges they face in facing and kind of bringing along the young people. And one of the things, the number one thing you notice there is they say 86% of the problem, or 86% of youth, they're too busy. It's hard to have a sit down conversation with them. It's hard to organize a Bible study with a group of young people simply because they're too busy. And it's not that we're busy doing things that are more important, right? What's more important than the word of God? And so yeah, kids are busier with sports, things revolving around entertainment, whatever it may be, school. 41%, the parents just don't take a big enough interest. And that's really what a lot of this comes down to is sometimes we rely very heavily on the church when the bulk of the work in reality has got to be accomplished at home. And then finally, another thing that is challenging for teachers and ministers reaching the young is breakdown of families, right?
Yeah.
When there's problems at home, I think we notice at times where young people suddenly become disconnected because there's emotional turmoil going on. And so I don't want this to be about, and I know Jack and Brent don't want this to be about, oh, kids these days, because the reality is that there's something better that we can be doing. And I really admire a lot of young people. I think that we're growing up, or I'm seeing a generation grow up that's perhaps more compassionate than many generations in the past. And there's just a lot of positive things to say about them. They're very open-minded, which on one hand that can be viewed as a negative, but on the other hand, they are open to reason if we sit down and talk with them. And so how is it that we as influencers, whether it be parents or preachers or teachers, how is it that we can do a better job of overcoming these challenges? I have one quote that's really interesting. This is a book called Soul Searching: The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers. It was basically an author that was just researching spirituality and religion today, and kind of interviewing and kind of getting boots on the ground and getting firsthand knowledge of what's going on in the mind of teenagers. And this first quote here, the first part of this quote, is not a slight towards teens. It's a reflection on us as teachers, I think.
More
First
as
off,
parents
yes.
and teachers in the church. Yes.
Because the issue isn't that kids aren't smart. Kids are very smart and they're capable of learning, as we know, a lot in a small amount of time. But she starts off by saying the majority of teenagers are incredibly inarticulate about their faith. That is, they have a hard time describing accurately what it is they believe. Religious beliefs and practices and its place in their lives. She goes on to say, many young people believe a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. Fair enough. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. That's not too bad. But here's where it gets concerning. The central goal of life, they believe, is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. You can imagine all the ways that that suddenly starts to become dangerous, that kind of thinking, just to feel good about oneself. God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And
like
that's
the genie in the bottle. You just call on him when you need him.
Yeah, exactly. And good people go to heaven when they die. And so it's not based on what Christ did. It's just based on whether or not I'm a morally sound person. And so all this is really kind of concerning.
Well, yeah. And so we asked the question then, what is the solution to all this? And the way we counter the voice of media and the voice of educators, and they're not all bad, of course, we know that. It comes from God's word, and he's going to be the source of truth that gives us freedom. And that's the voice that's going to utter that has to come first of all from the family. And so who better than to talk about family and home family, but someone that has taught classes at college on home and family, has written books and preached on it over the years. And we're going to go travel all the way up to Washington. Now, it's not as far as Indiana, but if you were to travel I-5 through some of the traffic, you might think it's a long trip. 4 hours, 39 minutes, depending on the traffic, all the way to Kirkland, Washington, where I used to live. Ann and I, when we first got married, lived in Kirkland. Our first boy was born there. And we worship with the Kirkland Church of Christ.
I was born in Kirkland Hospital, by the way.
No way.
Yes,
right.
way.
Well, so we're going back to our roots, to the Church of Christ at Kirkland, where we're going to find my good friend, Brent Hunter. Used to be a professor at Florida College, has been preaching all his life. And he's a family man. Not only is he married to a wonderful lady named Gail, he is a father of kids and many grandkids. And I hope these are all your grandkids, Brent, on the next picture. I'm not sure. I didn't check it with you, but he's a family guy and he knows all about home and family. So, Brent, welcome to our show, our talk, I should say. It's not a show. And we're going to let you give us all the answers we need how to nurture spirituality in our families. Welcome. Glad to have you.
Well, thank you. That's a rather interesting intro.
Yeah. And we're going to really ask you to speak loud because we're not hearing you well.
Like
I
you
don't know
said,
why.
if you can even pick up your mic and put it in front of your face, that might even be better because it's just quiet for some reason.
Okay, is this better?
It's a little better, yeah.
A little better, a little better.
Something's wrong with your connection on your computer. So you're going to have to put it right in your mouth and yell, I think. Yeah.
Hold on just a minute. How come we didn't have an issue when we did the practice run, brothers? Let me try.
That's how anything live goes, right? Everything bad that can happen happens when everyone's watching.
Yes. Okay. I think that should be better. Is that better?
Not really. So I'm going to ask you down to your little microphone on the left-hand corner of the Zoom. There's an up arrow.
Yes, I see that.
And you go to audio settings, the first line. And then you need to increase your volume on your mic there. There's a sliding bar about halfway down.
All right. It says select a speaker.
No, go down below. It says microphone.
Yeah. I think this will be better.
Can't see my Zoom on screen share.
Okay, here we go. Actually, the volume's already up pretty high.
All right. Well, unclick automatically adjust volume if you or click it.
Hey, Jack?
Yes, ma'am.
What if you mute the participants' mics? He might come in clearer.
Everyone is muted, Ann.
Yeah, everyone's muted.
Except for you.
I'm
You
not.
muted yourself.
Better now?
Not
Better?
really. You're going to have to hold it right up to your mouth, and we're just going to have to go with that. All right?
Wow, it works so well in our practice session.
That's better
Yeah.
though, right there. That's even
Yeah.
better. So
Well, welcome
Okay.
again. Sorry
All
about
right.
this.
Okay. Well, faith cometh by hearing and hearing by the word of God, right? So we got to make sure folks can hear for this to do any good. You know, the focus of what we're trying to do today is to make sure that we instill a personal faith in our children. And we sometimes confuse the idea that parents will teach their children their faith, but there's a sense in which that's true. But obviously what we've got to do is help them to have their own faith, because we all love our grandchildren, but God has no grandchildren. We're all children by faith. And so the question is, what can we do to really instill the proper kind of religious belief? One of the things I thought about when Sam was talking is that in the 1950s or so, they did studies about people and their values and what is it that people have that help to maintain what their values were. And all the research, all the social science literature said in the 1950s, the parents were the #1 influence upon their children.
Yeah.
After that was their peers, their friends. After that was the media of the day, the movies, the radio, all that kind of stuff that was available, TV. And then fourth was institutions such as schools and churches. So those were the 4 things that would shape a person's values and character way back in the 1950s.
So how's that changed today?
Well, from the 2000s on, now by far in the average home, the #1 thing that shapes a person's values is the media. And of course, now we add lots of screen time, social media, Facebook, Instagram, all the different things that our young people are just so tuned into. And you're absolutely right. They watch the media and certain things are promoted as being normal and cool. And that's sort of overwhelming as far as the message that gets through to them, especially if we as parents are not careful to monitor the media. The second thing that maintains people's values today on all types of studies is their peer group. They often are more interested in fitting in with whoever their peers are than anything else. Thirdly, it's their parents. So parents have dropped to number 3. And then number 4 is still institutions such as schools and churches.
Right. Well, you outlined very good the challenge. So if it's going to be peers and it's going to be the media and their voices are so much louder, when it comes to us speaking louder than them, who does that responsibility first fall upon? The parents in the home or the church where those children are part of?
Well, obviously, what happens in the home is much more critical than what's going on in a church assembly. I'm not downplaying that, but I want you to notice that the influence of churches and schools is in number 4.
Okay.
And so what we've got to do as parents, if we're really serious about teaching and training our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, is we've got to figure out how can I in my home go against the grain and wind up being the primary influence upon their thinking and their values, and ultimately be able to maintain their own faith.
So can I ask a question real quick?
Yes.
Do you think it's about being, kind of flipping that once again and becoming the number one influence? Or is it the numbers are what they are and it's about us making as much use of the time we have with them as possible?
Well, a little bit of both. I'd like to suggest that parents need to be really aware of what the kids are watching. Of course, as Jack and I have talked about at length, there's a tremendous danger now that our young people are exposed to pornography at young ages, and the average person that gets involved with that sees it on their smartphone. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to keep that away from our children today and our teens, and yet so critical to deal with that early and to maybe have some sort of not just filters, but monitors, so you really know as much as possible what it is they're watching and try to limit the amount of time. And not just limit, but try to substitute positive things with their interaction with the media so that you can help follow Proverbs 4:23 and keep their heart with all diligence. So that's a real challenge. And, like you said, that's such an important factor today. And it's really important that we keep that in mind. And in Proverbs 13:20, it says, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. So, who are their friends? Who are they hanging with? My dad is often asked, my mother and father, you had 4 kids, they're all faithful Christians. What do you attribute in part to your success? Well, there's a lot of things that could be said, but they were wanting us whenever possible to bring our friends over to our house. So see what was going on and they could monitor it. And they encouraged, as much as possible friendships with, really good kids and kids from, the congregation. And, it's very true. Be careful whom you allow into the sanctuary of your soul, for you'll share their destiny for good or for evil. So those are 2 major things that every parent needs to focus in on. And by the way, if you're watching a sitcom and 2 unmarried people are jumping in bed with some third party, some members of the opposite sex, and acting like that's just cool, I think the best thing to do these days, you can, stop it and you can say, what do you think about that? Is that the right thing to do? Is that what a godly person would do? They're promoting this as just being completely normal. Well, not for a person who's trying to please God, and not for a person who wants to save themselves for their spouse one day, which is certainly what you want to do.
I got to say, I really like that, because I think the traditional response is unplug the TV, right? When something like that happens, unplug the TV, pull out, the DVD, whatever it is. And I think there's a place for that. But so often we we kind of turn away from those opportunities probably that are teaching moments, which is kind of what you're
Right.
making that sound like. We got to take
Yes.
advantage of teaching moments that we have.
And I'll piggyback on that because maybe particular me or my generation be embarrassed. So you'd switch channels or
Yeah.
stop. So I like what you're saying, stop and actually have a conversation.
Yes, whenever you can. I remember when our kids were young, you remember how famous Home Alone was, and everybody
Yes.
watched the comic and all that. And of course, the child star in that was just so disrespectful and belligerent to his parents, and the way he talked to his mom especially. And several times right in the middle of Home Alone, I said, would we let you kids talk to your mom and dad that way? And they go, are you kidding? We can't even roll our eyes, much less talk that way to you.
Wow.
And I go, well, that's the reason for it,
Yeah.
because you need to honor father and mother. And so we tried to not just say, okay, we can't watch Home Alone. It was a fun movie.
Mhm.
But when things came up that went against our family values, we would use it as a teaching opportunity. And
good.
so
No.
whenever you can watch things with your children, instead of just leave them to kind of to their own devices, I think there's a real value in that.
Good. We showed a verse just a second ago. We're going to show it again because when we talk about this, I'm fearful that sometimes parents feel like this is daunting. I don't know if we can get this done. So there's this verse that is full of promise and hope in Proverbs 22, and yet it's challenging verse. So can you explain or help us understand what this verse means? And I'll read it
Sure.
first for everybody. Proverbs, he says, train up a child, and that's what we're talking about here, in the way that he should go, he or she. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. That sounds like a hopeful promise, but yet we see sometimes Christian kids fall away. Can you help us understand this verse?
Well, you have to make sure that you don't interpret any scripture so that you're taking away people's free will. And if this is an absolute, then you're basically saying the child has no choice.
Okay.
And of course, that's just very much a part of our being made in the image of God. God is a free moral agent. We are free moral agents. And our children, we can mold them and shape them and encourage them, but ultimately they have to, as I said before, they have to be regenerated. They have to have their own faith, and they have to choose to accept your example and your teaching. And we have lots of examples of really good godly men like Samuel, who wound up having rotten kids. And there's nothing said in that text negative about Samuel necessarily in his parenting. And of course, you can even look at Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, you could say, had this, perfect parenting from God the Father, and yet they sinned and rebelled. So, sadly, this verse has been used to have, in many cases, really good godly parents who did their best to feel all, buoyed up with guilt, like, well, must have been because I did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's possible that maybe a lack of good parental teaching or example has to do with how a child turns out, but it can't be absolute. And we need to understand that Proverbs are simply a literary device. They're truisms by which they give us basic truths, but they're never seen as absolute guarantees. For example, in the verse, just 2 verses before Proverbs 22 and verse 6, it says, the reward of humility and the fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life. Well, does that mean that everybody who's
Right.
humble and fears the Lord is going to have honor and a long life and riches? Well, you're more likely to be blessed if you follow godly principles, but we all know there are exceptions.
Exactly.
So, I just think we need to understand, on the one hand, this verse seems to indicate that you can have a tremendous impression if you do a good job in nurturing and training up your children. But on the other hand, it's not absolute, and every parent needs to recognize that, there is a risk involved, just like when God made humanity, there was a risk. The other thing I'd like to mention, Jack, is that I'm not even sure that this verse, in the context of Proverbs being a pragmatic truths that deals with practical life, sort of under verses, necessarily always some theological truth. I'm told in the original language, word should is not even in the text. And the
I wondered
idea
about that.
is that you should train a child in the way he has a natural bent, seems to be the idea. So perhaps this is actually telling us that parents need to look for the child's natural strengths and gifts that God has given him or her, and try to direct them in the way that they should go, the way that they would normally go according to their natural bent, so that when they get older, they're not in some career that their parent pushed them into because maybe it was prestigious or maybe it was profitable, kind of lucrative, but it's not really fitting their niche. So try to encourage children in their natural strengths, and then later on when they get old, they won't have a midlife crisis and be unhappy.
That's helpful.
Maybe that's another way to understand this verse that's often overlooked.
And so we're not cloning kids to all look alike, because everyone has their natural disposition or personality. And as parents, we want to recognize and nurture that direction. Good.
Yeah.
But there's hope then in it too, then, because they're going to be happy. And,
I guess I'm just thinking in my mind, what does it actually look like? Like, I think that it really should be something we're setting up where, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. In fact, causes someone to feel cherished or practice to point someone in an exact direction. Don't run out in the traffic. And when you hear me say stop, you stop. I want you to stop on a dime. And we did that with my youngest. She goes, oh, okay. And then I actually said, okay, let me show you. Good parenting includes modeling and dad. And I said, oh, that may be right, but I may be mistaken about that. Why don't you try that respectfully?
Nice.
Because we wanted them to ask how they felt. We didn't want to in any way hamper good communication, but they needed to do so respectfully and allow them to roll their eyes and in any way show disrespect.
So were you careful? It sounds like you're careful in not matching that energy. Like when they would maybe start yelling at you, I mean, because the tendency sometimes can be to yell right back and get in a shouting match and outduel them that way. But it sounds like, and he almost sent chills down my spine, because I can think of times where it's like, it was much more painful for me as a child when like my parents remained calm and they were instructing me. It's like, oh, why did I say that? It seemed to get the point across so much clearer for me.
Yeah.
That's helpful. And it kind of takes us to the next verse, because we don't want to exasperate our children. But you bring up an interesting point, because there's a big difference in what I hear you saying, Brent, than teaching information and training them how to live it. And so there's, I was, our kids raised like you were in a preacher's family. And I'd assume sometimes they got it by osmosis, because they were going to the classes, they went to services, they were always with me. I took them to classes myself, private ones. But training's different, isn't it? So what responsibility does the father have? Is it chief in the family, or is it secondary to the mother? Can you talk about this verse in Ephesians 6 where it says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. There's two different words there too, discipline and instruction.
Sure. Well, I think it's interesting that the fathers are addressed. Obviously, the mom and dad work together as a partnership in parenting. And I think it's very important that the mom and dad have a united front. Occasionally, when Gail and I weren't really sure how to handle a situation, we would sort of excuse ourselves and go into the side room and talk between us about it. And then we'd agree with what we're going to do. And then we would come out and say, okay, this is how we're going to handle this. We never let the kids play one against the other. And it was never appropriate after I said no to go to mom and try to get mom to say yes. Either you hang together or you're hang separately. But certainly the fathers are supposed to show appropriate leadership here in the home. And this provoking or exasperating your children to anger would be like over disciplining for small offenses, inappropriately yelling. We didn't allow yelling in our house. And I never, that I can recall, would want to yell at Gail or have Gail yell at me, because you model those things before the kids. So again, if they see you yelling, then that sort of gives them an excuse to yell. So you need to be careful that you don't jump to conclusions, and you listen, and you don't, have inappropriate punishments, or certainly anything that's abusive in any way. And if you keep the lines of communication open, then you're able to nurture them and discipline them and instruct them, because they will be open to your instruction. In a marriage, it's very similar. In a marriage, if you have been involved in what Dr. Willard Harley would refer to as love busters, if you're familiar with the book, His Needs, Her Needs.
Sure.
If you've offended your spouse, then your spouse, tends to have their barriers up, and you offend a teenager, you try to put your arm around him and pull away. Well, how are you supposed to instruct or nurture someone if they're not willing first to listen? So first and foremost, keep the communication lines open. Don't provoke them. And then secondly, then they're in a position, because their spirit is open, for you to really instruct them and give them the loving discipline that they need when they need it. Studies have shown that corporal discipline is a complete failure if the person that's administering it is not seen by the child as someone who loves them. But if the child knows this parent is crazy about them, and then they choose to give them appropriate discipline, then they focus in on the behavior and how I need to change, instead of how dare you have touched me. So there's a lot you could say on that, but that's to me some of the wisdom in that verse. And yes, the fathers need to be the leader of the home in discipline as well as in teaching as much as possible.
Two words obviously that came to mind when you're talking there. One of them you already said, love. They need to know that you love them. I think it's the same concept that we need to know God loves us in order for us to trust him. But then there's that second word that, everything you're saying was bringing to mind is trust. You think that, isn't trust just a huge part of it? Not just our trust in the younger people or the kids, but being someone that they can trust. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. The kids need to be able to look up to their mother and father and honor them, not just out of fear, but because they know that this father is taking care of them. And I'll say this as well, that moms often, because they sometimes spend a lot more time with their kids than with the dad, have a lot to do with their spiritual instruction just by the virtue of the quantity of time spent with them. But research has shown that the faith step of the sons, about 80% of the time, they will follow in the direction of the father, because those teenage boys will look up to their dad. And if he goes to church, and if he values that, and if he prays with him at night, there's a very good chance those sons will not just respect the father, but respect the dad. But if the dad acts like religion is for women and little kids, and it's kind of a crutch, and he's going to stay at home and read the paper while the family goes to church, 80% of the time, that dynamic will cause the boys to say, well, if dad doesn't have to go, why do I have to go?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So it's a central role for the father.
Yes, very much so.
We think the mother generally be the nurturer, but if I understand correctly, when he says bring up your children, the word bring up, I don't know that's the New American Standard. It's the same word for nurturing that's in chapter 5, when it says about husbands, nurture your wife as you nurture your own body. So there is that type of nurturing concept here from the father to the children, and it's not just reserved for the wife or the mother. So speaking about the mom, they have a huge role, obviously, because like you well said, they spend most of the time, don't they, with the child generally. And I'm always impressed with Timothy, because Paul was mindful of the faith that his grandmother and his mother passed down on to him. And then in chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, he said, remember where you learned it from your childhood. So it was his mother, because his father was an unbeliever, a Greek, as we understand.
Yep.
How important is the mom's role in raising children spiritually?
Well, obviously they're both very, very vital very important. A lot of our earliest memories come from literally being on our mom's, lap. And hopefully, we can pass down our faith from generation to generation. And neither one really should be underestimated. I think Abraham Lincoln said that there's no greater blessing in life to be born into the home of a godly mother.
Yes.
And I certainly feel that way with my mom. And so much of this is modeled before the children. And both mother and father should not just look for formal instruction opportunities, but should be very mindful of the importance of just throughout your life, you look for opportunities for teachable moments. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, it says that these commandments that I give unto you should be in your heart, and you should teach them diligently to your children. You should talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. So people are talking about the coronavirus and the kids are scared, and you can say, well, the most important thing for our family, since our family values God and things spiritual, and one day we'll spend eternity in heaven, is are we going to test positive for faith? Are we going to keep a safe distance from doubt? And are we going to make sure we isolate ourselves from unbelief?
Well, very good.
Some way to kind of shift things over and constantly remind the children of what's most important.
Everything's a teaching moment, isn't it?
Test ourselves for faith. That's good.
It should be.
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember my mom, we had 6 children in our family. And so there was 2 in one bedroom, 2 in another, and 2 in another. And there was a corner. Every night we'd say our prayers, and she'd stand at the corner of the hallway, open up her Bible and read stories out of the Old Testament. And that's just something that stayed with me all my life. That's how I learned a lot of those original stories or narratives from the Old Testament. Little things that we can do just throughout the day can make a difference.
Yeah, the teachable moments are critical. I think we make a mistake if we kind of compartmentalize what we go to church and like that's worship. You can worship at home. You can stop anytime and say a prayer. Gail has always been really wonderful about seeing a car accident or something, and she want to stop immediately and say a prayer for those people. And
Wow.
and so it's a life that is lived consistently as much as you can in front of them all the time.
And another text, I know that we already talked about how a majority of the lessons are done at home and by the parents, but I think the church does obviously, and you would agree with this, fits into it at a certain point, but not just in the most obvious ways as far as preaching sermons and teaching classes. But I think about Titus chapter 2, and just where Paul instructs Titus to tell the older women to teach the younger women. And I know we were talking about today that that whole idea, it takes a village to raise a child. I think there's a lot of truth to that. While we're not trying to take the roles away from other parents, obviously, there are kids that look up to us. And we should be, at least I try to take advantage of that influence I have and influence them positively and try not to squander it. Anyways.
So we're talking about other part of the Christian family being a role. I like the next verse that we were going to look at, where the psalmist says, you've taught me from my youth, and I still declare your wondrous deeds, even though I'm old and gray, some of us more so than others.
Getting grayer all the time, Jack.
But that means wisdom. But he says, don't forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation. He's made a commitment to pass on what was passed on to him. So this nurturing spirituality, all of us can partake in it with, like Sam said, someone else's other children, like taking them under our wing.
Yes, I like to tell the saints at Kirkland that we all one of the last verses in Malachi talks about the messianic reign and looking forward to the Messiah. And it says that the fathers will return their hearts to the children. And it's not just their children, but the children. So Jesus cared about children, and people that have been touched by the gospel are going to have a special interest in children as well. And so godly men and women who see other families that are trying to raise up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, they can be a part of that, and they can help and encourage, and they can be vibrant Bible class teachers. They can be hospitable, they can have play days together where the same kind of values are articulated by, the peers that they have in God's family. I think we make a big mistake sometimes by talking too much about our youth being the church of tomorrow. I know there's a sense in which that's true. The elders and deacons and hopefully evangelists and all that will eventually come from our youth. But if a person is gotten to the point where they've made a decision to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and they've been baptized for the remission of their sins, that's a big deal. They're a very important part of the church now.
They're part of the church today. Yeah.
And of the church today. And even people that aren't baptized, they're still God's natural children. They still have an innocence, and they can still show a love for God. And they're all important. And we need to get that message across. And if I could just, talk about a real concern that I have, and that is that, I understand the value of families worshiping together and the little kids not having some sort of class during the worship period, but that they all witness, what they need to in the worship service. But if you're not careful, when the kids are little, they're taught just to sort of be quiet and to color and to be disengaged. At a very early age, they need to start singing as much as they can and participating in the worship and engaging in at least something of what the preacher is saying, maybe notes for the kids to take. Because if you're not careful, they're going to continue just to sort of sit there and be quiet and not bother anybody, but never really engage in what's happening. And as soon as they get a chance to leave, to them, the church is boring because they've never felt a part of it. And so I think that's really important early on to start making sure the kids are engaged in worship.
That's nice. Yeah. And that was, of course, modeled in the Old Testament when during the Passover, they asked, what are we doing this for, Dad? And they were participating in the process, actually. So the church has a complementary role, don't they, in raising children, in people's homes. I mean, people's children.
And,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I just really appreciate your point that kids are part of the church today. And actually, it's not just that they're a part of it. They're a big part of it. They're a major part. I think we sometimes treat them like they have a future role, but they don't yet actually have a role in the church. It's like, no, if you've obeyed the gospel, you play an important part of the church because they're able to go to a place every day and teach and have spiritual conversations with hundreds of other young people that are at a more impressionable age than really what an adult is going to come into contact with on a daily basis. Yeah. And I think that we've kind of maybe squandered some of those opportunities.
Oh,
and so
definitely.
I appreciate what you say.
In fact, the older you get after the age of like 17 or 18, the less likely it is statistically that you'll obey the gospel. So who is it that can be the most effective in reaching their peers, even more so than adults? It's actually junior high and high school kids who have a faith and are serious about what they're doing and talk to their friends who are more open-minded and haven't become closed-minded yet. So
interesting.
We had a situation in Oldham Woods where we had a young lady there that was real cute, and she said she wouldn't date anybody till they went to church with her first. So boy, did the guys come rolling in. And
there you go.
At any rate, so we just started working with them, having them work with their peers, and our young people's group like doubled in the 3 years or so that we were there. And a lot of it was, the young people working with their peers, and they were easier to reach than adults. So, wow, they were really the source of most of our growth. They were the church of the moment, and we need to help our young people to see the value of that.
Yes.
Well, that's a good way to segue into our last part of our discussion here. We want to talk about practical things that parents, families can do. And we wanted to invite questions from members. We had one lady ask about what could you say about devotions in the home and how would they look and how do you feel about taking time out for spiritual devotions in the home?
Very, very important. And, as long as you complement it with talking about spiritual things whenever you can, taking advantage of these teachable moments. I've got some slides here where I talk about some practical tips for parenting. Looks like we've only got about 6 minutes left.
That's okay. Go ahead. Let's see them.
Yeah, let's see him.
Yeah, let me go ahead and shift over to that if we could. Let me see if I can get this down as we sort of wrap this up. These are some real quick kind of creative tips about parenting that I think you'll find valuable.
We'll see if you're as good at tech as you are as at home and family.
I think I'm better at home and family. Yeah, let me just quickly talk
There you go.
about some
Perfect.
Tips for parenting. That come up all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Looks good.
Okay. One of the things that I really recommend is this resource by Barbara Decker, Proverbs for Parenting. It's a topical guide from the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs are especially poignant and easy for children to remember because they're so usually just one sentence.
Yeah.
And so the table of contents is very, very practical. It talks about reverence and trust for God, value of wisdom, self-control, diligence, temper, pride, use of the tongue. My favorite Proverbs has to do with harsh words are like thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Then you ask your child, was that like stabbing somebody with a knife? Or do you want to be someone who brings about healing rather than hurt? Why don't you rephrase that and say that in a better way? Talks about tattletaling. I mean, you can.
I'm going to ask you to pick up your mic again too.
You can
Yeah.
easily memorize these Proverbs and have them at the tip of your tongue and
Yes.
ready to use them at appropriate moments. Humility, mercy, strength. Well, the Proverbs are just rich. The second tip for parenting that I think is really interesting, that's often overlooked, is the Bible makes a big deal about names and what names mean. And oftentimes in the margin, it will say, and God named Adam, which means man, and then Adam named his wife Eve, which is the mother of all living. From the very beginning, there's a big focus on everything in heaven is fitly named. And kids love to learn about their names and what they mean. For example, Sam means answered prayer.
Wow, Sam, you're our answered prayer.
Yes.
And so,
yes.
Sam, you are true to your name in so many ways, right?
Well, you bring up an interesting point because I'm not being arrogant. That's why my parents lost a child. And that is why they named me that, because they lost a child and then they had me. And I'll tell you, that made me feel really special and loved, knowing that they thought of a name such.
Yes.
One that means
and so this has
prayer.
a lot to do with the child's self-esteem.
Nice.
You knowing that has helped you. And every time someone calls your name, you remember that you truly are an answered prayer. And so we named our daughter Amy, which means beloved, because we wanted her to always know how she was loved. Allison was honest one because we wanted her to have a good and honest heart. If you had a son named Timothy and you said, we named you Timothy because your very name means devoted to God, I think that's going to help a young man's spirituality as that's, laid up in his heart. So this book gives you a list of, basically 10,000 names. I encourage young couples before they, have children to really think through what they're going to name their kids so they can talk to them about it later.
So really, this spiritual nurturing starts even while the child's in the womb. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we wanted our kids to know why we named them Amy and Allison and what that meant. So that's an interesting tip. And even if you didn't think about it that much, you can still look up your child's name, and there's usually a spiritual connotation, and make that an important part of who they are. And by the way, you were talking about devotions. Make the family dinner hour sacred. Don't just run in and out and leave food for people to eat on the run. Listen to this study. The more often a child eats dinner with his or her family, the less likely that child is to smoke, drink, or use drugs. frequent family dining is correlated with doing well in school and developing healthy eating habits. This pattern holds true regardless of the gender, of the child's gender, family structure, or socioeconomic level. In fact, I was really impressed with this study of national merit scholars. They were trying to find out, what do these children have in common that are in the top, I think, 2% of the nation academically. Almost without exception, the most astounding teenagers grew up in homes where the whole family sat down and ate dinner together at night.
Wow.
And so,
so just to piggyback on what you're saying, it sounds like the whole idea of having, a devotion with your family. It's not like, hey, kids, we're going to have a 15 minutes, where I'm going to preach a sermon at you.
No,
but it can be at the dinner table and just having a spiritual conversation, right?
Yes, I would recommend that it be at the dinner table. In fact.
Cool.
That's what we did. And that was a time where we could continue to talk about it even afterwards while you're eating. When you're eating, you share things. These people that were National Merit Scholars said from their earliest memories was around the dinner table, their parent or parents talking to them about the importance of education. Mm-hmm. Well, I've been an educator most of my life. Education is important, but I remember my mom and dad, my dad leading the discussion, talking about the importance of God and country. I mean, he just instilled spirituality in us, and he talked about it all the time. Cool. And so those are some of the reasons why he instilled faith in me, along with my wonderful mother. And so later on, Gail and I found out about this, our Daily Bread Promise Box. It's filled with 240 Bible promises. We keep this up on our table, and when we have guests over, we say, you'll love these. They're calorie free. And we like the fact that before we nourish our bodies, gluten-free, before we nourish our bodies, we want to make sure we nourish our souls. And so we have everybody around the table read a Bible promise, and we talk about it briefly.
Really?
Yeah. One of my daughters still has a daily bread box around for her to use as a guide for a family devotion. Cool. So I also highly recommend, maybe during this coronavirus time, you can sit down and decide, let's have our own family creed, our own family motto. My kids were very small. We sat down and said, what kind of family do we want to have? And we jotted down some adjectives, and we ran them all together. And it says, we're a loving, affectionate, responsible, obedient, cheerful, godly family. We always do our best to finish what we start. And so frequently before we would have our meal in the evening, we would say either our family motto or we would say a family memory verse, because we're a family that loves God, and that's what we do. And it was very special. And the kids helped to write it. It was our family motto. Nice. And it wasn't just, a statement of what we thought we were, because we had room to grow, but it was sort of visionary, what we want to make sure we become.
Nice.
Awesome.
Can you share your family verse? That would be interesting.
Oh, we had lots of family verses.
Okay.
I mean, Gail had a whole list of family verses and cards that she would keep in a rubber band on the table, and we would go through and review them periodically.
Cool.
And so, so in fact, a while back, I asked my daughters, what were their favorite proverbs, and they both rattled off different proverbs that meant a lot to them that they learned as they were kids. It's still laid up in their hearts. And so we can do a lot to instill faith in our children. You may know Ralph Walker. This was his family motto or creed. He said, we are the walkers. We walk in paths of righteousness. We're a family of loving, supportive people. Our goal is to help each other be our best. We focus on whatever is true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, and of good reputation. We strive for excellence and being worthy of praise. We are the walkers, and walker women don't wear brown.
I don't have a good enough memory for that. I'd be in trouble if I was one of their kids.
Well, you know what? You say it often and long enough, and eventually you get it down. But he had 3 daughters, and they didn't look good in brown, so they put that in their motto. Here's one of my favorites. This is the Kraft family from Athens, Alabama. We're a compassionate, cheerful, crazy, conscientious, come on over Christian family. We cherish the name and sacrifice of Christ, the truth of his holy word, and each other. And sometimes we're cat-loving, cinema-viewing, chicken-eating, chocolate-loving couch potatoes. So they memorized that, and that was who they were, and they loved it. So I want to challenge all of you listening to this. If you have kids at home, to take some time to come up with a family motto or creed or mission statement or whatever you want of your own. And by the way, if you want more direction about this, Stephen Covey, in his excellent book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families, has a whole chapter on the value of a family mission statement.
Nice.
Highly
Awesome.
recommend it.
Nice.
Awesome.
Good.
So
Boy, those are really
Yeah.
helpful.
Yep.
You surprised me with I wasn't expecting those kind of ideas. That's
Appreciate
great.
that. Yeah.
I wanted them to be, at least a little bit creative for us here.
Mhm.
And let me also mention one other thing as I kind of get back to Zoom.
Okay, now while he's going that, if there's someone in the audience has a
a
question or a suggestion themselves, we want to take that now. So Anne says it's excellent to have a family motto. I guess I'm going to develop one with her when I get home now.
Good.
So no, that's a great idea. And but if anyone's got something, go ahead and raise your hand or put it in the chat box. So what else you got?
Well, I just wanted to mention that, basic behavioral mod says what you reinforce gets repeated.
Mhm.
And I think parents are too quick to brag about how smart their kids are and how handsome or beautiful their kids are. I'm not against occasionally saying that, your kids are smart and handsome or beautiful. But if the focus is on externals, what are they going to think is most important? What are they going to put their focus on?
Right.
Well, I think it'd be much better if parents could really look for opportunities to catch their children doing things that are right and really commend them for it. Boy, I really appreciate your generosity, how you shared that toy with your sister, or wow, you were honest about that. You're an honest person. Continue to live up to that character. When they show empathy or spirituality or discipline, wow, I appreciate the discipline. You got up right away. You got ready in record time. Good for you. We appreciate disciplined people because disciples are disciplined. In other words, think about the ideal character traits you would want in your children and then bring them out by every time you see them, just bend over backwards, praising them for their character traits more so than things that are just on the surface, like how pretty their hair looks.
Yes. You're building the inside out because that's where
Yes.
God looks to the heart rather than the outside. Good.
Correct.
Yeah. And that addresses a lot of the self-esteem issues that children, all of us have struggled with as we grow up. Good.
Yes.
Well, boy, I can't believe how fast
too.
the hour went, because we could go myself
on.
personally for a long time.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. I got someone with a message. Let's see what they have to say. This is, I think, Ann Hoover. I'm guessing.
No, it's your wife, Ann, actually.
Oh, it's Ann, iPad Ann.
Yeah.
Hello,
How important
iPad
it
Ann.
is to instill a spiritual vision in child thinking about when they leave home. And Heather's question, I don't know what that is.
Oh, that was Heather's question is what she's saying.
Oh.
Heather's asking that question.
How important is it to instill a spiritual vision in the child thinking about when they leave home? I think you kind of addressed that, but maybe you can say something.
Well, I'd just like to say, I know we've already gone over a little bit, but from the time my kids were very young, we talked about who you're going to marry. Only marry a Christian, and, what's your life going to be like in the future? And more important than just they're going to be a nurse or what, that's what the world focuses in on is their vocation. Yes. My dad was really good about saying, I don't really care what you do, son, as long as it's honest. But the most important thing is you grow up to glorify God. How can you do that? And those kind of messages made a huge impression on me as I thought about what really mattered. And so when people would ask me, what are you going to do when you grow up? It wasn't I was going to be a lawyer, which is what I thought I was going to be most of my young life. Mm-hmm. It was, well, I hope one day I can grow up to be an elder and shepherd souls. Because that's at the time a way, like my dad, who was an elder, could glorify God. And so, trying to instill those kind of principles and have them kind of look into the future. It's not too early for young people to think about, I want to be, a worthy woman of Proverbs 31, or I want to be a deacon or an elder or a preacher one day in the church. Instilling those kind of spiritual goals and vision so important because they're not going to get it hardly anywhere else.
Right. And I like to ask them along the same line, like, what are you going to do with yourself? And they, well, I want to go to school. No, what are you going to do with yourself for the Lord? Trying to get them create that vision. So
How
that's
you
very
can
helpful.
Use your gifts for the Lord.
That's right.
Nice.
Whether it's through your vocation, whatever. Jeff Walker, one of our elders, says he has all your material from Home and Family, and he says hello to you.
Oh, hey.
So yeah, he's watching. So is Jack Barrett, our other elder. Yeah, iPad Ann says thanks.
Yes.
You're welcome.
So,
Honestly, some of you guys from South Salem, I've got this lesson I recently did on the difference between teaching and training.
yes.
And we all train our kids one way or the other, whether we realize it or not.
Yes.
And this talks about how important training is and kind of builds on that principle. And a lot of parents have told me that really helped them to know how to better parent through
Nice.
role playing. So if anybody wants further info on that, you can go to our website and it
Cool.
should be available.
Appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
We want to thank you so much.
Yeah.
And maybe we can have you back again. I think it was successful. What do you think?
Yeah, it's better than last time where we muted ourselves for the first 5 minutes. So,
Well, I'm
And-
sorry that you couldn't hear me very well. I hope it's
well,
better
no,
now.
you sound good now. So,
And frankly, you know, hearing what you say makes me look back and I could have done such a better job as parents. And so to all the parents out there, it's on the job training. This is why we do these things with Brent. I thank you. So we can do the best we can, but none of us are perfect. And I appreciate what you said. We shouldn't beat ourselves up with guilt because we want to raise up the children, right?
Sure.
But they still have free will and
Yeah.
they're gonna have to make a choice.
By the way, one final recommendation. Once your kids do obey the gospel, make a big deal out of their spiritual birthdays. Celebrate
Celebrate
their
it.
spiritual birthdays. You've been a Christian a year, 2 years. How you doing? What does that mean? Their new birth is a whole lot more important than their physical birth. And so you ought to demonstrate that in your family.
That's a great
my
thought.
my Grammy wishes me happy birthday every single year of the anniversary of my baptism. So,
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. It's one of the
Yeah.
reasons you're a gospel preacher, Sam.
yeah, that's it. It's
Yeah.
all
An
because of my
answered prayer
Grammy.
and-
So,
An answered
Yeah.
prayer in more ways than one.
All right.
Well,
Well,
thank you all for the opportunity. This has
yeah,
been
thank
fun.
you.
you
Thank
can
you.
hang around if you want and visit with people, but we want to introduce next week's topic. And so we're excited to have, well, you go ahead and
Oh
introduce
yeah.
him.
So sorry, I guess I got a screen share so you can get a picture of him here.
Dave Larson says hello, and it's good to hear from you. But next week,
Yes. So we're gonna have Brent Willie on. So Brent Willie, not only did he officiate my wedding, but also he trained me to be a preacher for about 1.5 years while I was in Los Osos, and he's been preaching pretty much his whole life since the time he was out of college. So he's just a really knowledgeable man, a very good man, very hardworking man for the Lord. And so we're gonna have him on next Friday. And
we're excited about that.
yeah, it's just
We-
gonna be about staying spiritually focused.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
and we get to get all our questions ready for Brent so he can tell us the
Yes.
true story about Sam. You know, what was it like with Sam for 1.5 to 2 years?
Maybe not those kind
Yeah.
of questions. But
So that'll be great. All right. So that's going to end the formal part of our thing. But so we're going to stop our live stream. But one of the best things about Zoom, we're going to unmute everybody. And so if Brent, if you don't mind, they might
I don't
have a
mind at
question.
all.
Yeah. So, but we're really glad. So goodbye to you all on live stream. I hope you can come back next week for South Salem Talk at 12:30, and we'll send out emails as usual. All right.